Imagine waking to the sound of soldiers at your door. You have minutes to gather your children, a blanket, and whatever food you can carry. Behind you, the home your family built over generations will be taken, burned, or seized. Ahead lies 1,000 miles of wilderness, freezing rivers, and roads littered with shallow graves. This is not a story from a distant battlefield. It is not a tale of war, but of law. It is the story of how the United States, under the banner of progress and destiny, uprooted entire nations, driving over 100,000 men, women, and children from their ancestral homelands. The Cherokee would call it Nunna daul Tsuny, the trail where they cried. History remembers it as the Trail of Tears. But what truly happened on that trail? What forces set it in motion, and what was the human cost of America's hunger for land? This is the real untold story of the Trail of Tears, one of the America's darkest chapter. In this video, we uncover one of the darkest and most painful chapters in American history, a story of betrayal, survival, and the enduring spirit of a people nearly erased from their homeland. Before we continue, like, share, and subscribe to help our community grow. It is the spring of 1838. Dawn breaks over the forests of Georgia. A Cherokee family living on land their ancestors have called home for centuries. Here's the distant sound of hooves. U.S. soldiers are coming. They carry orders, and those orders will change this family's life forever. The Cherokee man grips the wooden doorframe of his cabin as troops dismount, rifles slung, and read aloud a government order. The family must leave immediately. There is no negotiation, no appeal. What begins as a morning like any other quickly descends into chaos. This was the reality for thousands of Native American families across the Southeast. Between 1830 and 1850, more than 100,000 Native men, women, and children were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, driven westward on a series of deadly marches now known collectively as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was not a single event, but rather a series of forced removals involving multiple tribes, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, collectively known as the 5 civilized tribes for their adoption of many European American customs. Yet, despite adopting aspects of white society, farming, literacy, even Christianity, these tribes found themselves targeted for removal. The growing hunger for land, particularly for cotton farming in the South, made their fertile homelands a prize for settlers and speculators. The Trail of Tears would stretch over 1,000 miles through forests, across rivers, and over mountains. It would claim thousands of lives, many from disease, starvation, and exposure. But before the forced marches began, before the cries of children and the graves dug along the roadside, there was something far more calculated at play. A government determined to remove Native people from the land entirely. At the heart of this tragedy lies a single law, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. But the seeds of this law were planted long before. They were rooted in decades of racial prejudice, land greed, and a growing American belief in manifest destiny, the idea that white settlers were destined to expand across the continent. Jackson called it progress. He claimed it was for the tribe's own good, to move them west where they could live undisturbed. But history tells another story, one of betrayal, broken promises, and death on a scale few could imagine. By 1830, tensions between white settlers and Native Americans had reached a boiling point. Farmers and land speculators, backed by state governments, were seizing lands through intimidation and fraudulent treaties. Violence erupted in frontier regions as settlers clashed with Native communities. For the Cherokee, whose lands covered parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee, the pressure was relentless. They had built thriving farms, schools, and even their own constitution modeled after that of the United States. But nothing could shield them from the rising tide of greed and power. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in American history, a campaign of forced displacement carried out under the banner of law and order, but driven by profit and prejudice. This is the true story of the Trail of Tears, told not as a distant event, but as the lived experience of those who walked its bloody path. To understand why the Trail of Tears happened, we must first understand the engine that fueled it, cotton. By the 1820s, cotton was king. The fertile lands of the Southeast, many still held by Native tribes, became the most sought-after real estate in the young United States. As the cotton industry exploded, so too did the demand for enslaved labor and land to grow it on. White planters looked to the vast territories of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole as the next frontier for profit. But these were not uncivilized tribes as politicians often claimed. Many had integrated aspects of European American society. The Cherokee, for example, had a written language created by Sequoyah, published their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, and operated schools and farms. Some even owned enslaved Africans themselves, a complex and often overlooked fact of their history. Despite these efforts to coexist, the tribe's success only made them a bigger target. Their fertile farmland, rivers, and forests were seen as obstacles to be cleared, not communities to be respected. The push for removal gained its loudest voice in Andrew Jackson, a man whose military career was built on fighting Native Americans. As a general, Jackson had led brutal campaigns against the Creek and Seminole, earning both fame and notoriety. By the time he became president in 1829, Jackson viewed Native tribes not as sovereign nations but as impediments to American expansion. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, giving the federal government authority to negotiate land exchange treaties with Native tribes. But these negotiations were anything but equal. Backed by military might and political pressure, the U.S. forced one-sided treaties that paved the way for mass displacement. One of the few obstacles to this policy came from the courts. The Cherokee Nation fought back, taking their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, the court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct, sovereign community and that Georgia's laws had no force within its territory. For a moment, it seemed the Cherokee might be saved, but President Jackson reportedly scoffed at the ruling, allegedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether the quote is apocryphal or not, the message was clear. The executive branch had no intention of protecting Native sovereignty. The path was now open. State governments, particularly Georgia, escalated their campaign of harassment and land seizures. Native families faced mounting threats, forced sales, and waves of settlers who ignored their rights entirely. By the mid-1830s, pressure reached a breaking point. The Cherokee, despite resistance and appeals to justice, were outmaneuvered politically. A controversial treaty, signed by a small faction of Cherokee leaders without the approval of Chief John Ross or the majority of the tribe, would seal their fate. In 1835, with state pressure mounting and federal troops waiting in the wings, a small group of Cherokee leaders gathered in New Echota, Georgia. They signed a treaty with the United States, ceding all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in present-day Oklahoma and financial compensation. But there was a catch. This treaty was not signed by Chief John Ross or the majority of the Cherokee people. It was negotiated by a minority faction, later known as the Treaty Party, who believed removal was inevitable and sought the best possible terms. The majority of the Cherokee viewed them as traitors. The Treaty of New Echota was ratified by the U.S. Senate by a single vote. To Washington, it was law. To the Cherokee Nation, it was treachery. Despite petitions with thousands of Cherokee signatures opposing the treaty, despite protests and pleas to Congress, the gears of removal were now turning. In the eyes of the federal government, every Cherokee still on their homeland after May 1838 would be considered trespassers. The Cherokee split grew violent. Members of the Treaty Party were targeted for assassination by their own people. John Ross, the principal chief, continued to lead diplomatic resistance, but Washington had already decided their fate. Meanwhile, other tribes had already begun their own forced removals. The Choctaw, the first to be expelled under the Indian Removal Act, endured brutal conditions during their march west in 1831 to 1832. One Choctaw leader described it bitterly to an American newspaper, calling it a trail of tears and death. For the Cherokee, this ominous warning became prophecy. As the deadline for removal approached, General Winfield Scott was ordered to assemble a force of 7,000 soldiers. Their mission, round up every Cherokee by any means necessary. The countdown had begun. Homes would soon be emptied, lives uprooted, and the largest forced migration in U.S. history would commence. In May of 1838, the Cherokee Nation's nightmare became reality. Under orders from the U.S. government, General Winfield Scott and his troops fanned out across Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. The mission was swift and merciless. Capture and detain every Cherokee man, woman, and child, and prepare them for forced relocation. Soldiers went door to door, often without warning. Families were given minutes, sometimes only seconds, to gather belongings. Many left behind homes, tools, and livestock that would be seized by settlers or the government. Thousands were herded into makeshift prison camps known as stockades. These crude, open-air enclosures, surrounded by wooden palisades and guarded by soldiers, became holding pens for entire communities. Disease, poor sanitation, and summer heat ravaged the detainees. By June 1838, over 13,000 Cherokee were imprisoned across more than a dozen stockades. Water was scarce, food rations meager, and outbreaks of dysentery and measles claimed lives even before the march began. The stockades were not just temporary camps. They were the first graves of the Trail of Tears. Contemporary accounts describe families burying their dead in shallow, unmarked graves within sight of the fences that held them captive. General Scott himself, though tasked with enforcing removal, wrote of the suffering with unease. He urged his men to treat the Cherokee with dignity and avoid unnecessary cruelty. But discipline among troops varied, and abuses were widespread. Meanwhile, white settlers wasted no time moving onto vacated Cherokee farms. Entire homesteads were auctioned off, often for pennies on the dollar, enriching speculators while families starved behind wooden walls. By late October, John Ross, who had negotiated to delay departures to avoid the deadly summer, organized the Cherokee into 13 groups, each led by their own chiefs, to travel at staggered intervals. The hope was to minimize suffering, but even this planning could not overcome the brutal conditions ahead. By late 1838, more than 16,000 Cherokee, men, women, and children, had been divided into detachments. Under the reluctant leadership of Chief John Ross and other tribal leaders, 13 groups prepared to march more than 1,000 miles to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The decision to stagger departures was an attempt to save lives. Earlier groups, sent out during the blistering summer heat, had already endured devastating losses. Ross negotiated for most of his people to wait until the cooler autumn, hoping to avoid disease and dehydration. But the winter of 1838 to 1839 would bring its own horrors. The Cherokee carried what they could: blankets, cooking pots, and meager supplies. Wagons and horses were scarce. Most walked, including the elderly and children. Guards rode on horseback, rifles in hand, driving the columns forward. The route stretched over mountains, across icy rivers, through endless forests, and across treacherous plains. Rain turned roads to mud, slowing the wagons and soaking the marchers to the bone. When winter storms arrived, the cold became lethal. The suffering was relentless. Food rations, typically cornmeal, salt pork, and hardtack, were often spoiled or insufficient. Streams and rivers froze, forcing detours and delays. Sickness spread quickly, especially among the very young and very old. Eyewitness accounts from soldiers and missionaries describe heartbreaking scenes: mothers cradling lifeless children, elders collapsing by the roadside, families forced to leave the dead behind in hastily dug graves. Estimates vary, but historians believe each day of the march claimed dozens of lives across the 13 detachments. Exposure, disease, starvation, and exhaustion combined into a relentless enemy more deadly than any soldier. Some detachments faced extraordinary hardships. Frozen rivers delayed crossings for days, leaving families huddled on snow-covered banks. Others became trapped in blizzards with little shelter. Horses died, wagons broke, and supplies dwindled. The Cherokee themselves showed remarkable resilience. Women tended the sick and shared what little food they had. Tribal leaders organized hunting parties when rations failed. Traditional songs and prayers became a source of strength in the long, bitter nights. But no amount of courage could fully counter the brutal conditions. By the time the last detachments crossed into Indian Territory in March of 1839, the Trail of Tears had left a path of grief stretching from the Appalachian foothills to the Oklahoma plains. The human cost of the Trail of Tears was staggering. Of the roughly 16,000 Cherokee forced west, nearly 4,000 died along the way, about 1 in every 4 people. Among the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, thousands more perished in their own removals. The phrase first used by a Choctaw leader, a trail of tears and death, became an enduring symbol of this tragedy. The causes of death were as relentless as they were varied. Dysentery, pneumonia, measles, and whooping cough spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary camps and along the road. Malnutrition and exhaustion weakened immune systems, turning minor illnesses into death sentences. But beyond the numbers were the stories, acts of courage, sacrifice, and resilience that reveal the humanity behind the tragedy. One such story is that of Nunna, also known as Nancy Ward, a respected Cherokee beloved woman. Though aging and frail, she reportedly comforted the sick, offering what food and medicine she could along the trail. Her presence became a source of solace to many, even as death stalked the camps. Another account tells of Cherokee leaders like John Ross, who personally paid for blankets, shoes, and medicine to ease the suffering of his people, despite losing his own wife, Quati, to pneumonia during the march. For every grave dug along the roadside, there were countless acts of compassion. Cherokee healers shared traditional remedies with missionaries to help treat disease. Families carried the weak on makeshift litters, refusing to leave anyone behind, even as the pace of the march pushed them to exhaustion. The Trail of Tears was more than a single event. It was the breaking of nations, the tearing apart of cultures, and the betrayal of countless promises. But even in this darkness, the resilience of the Cherokee and other tribes endured, laying the foundation for survival and rebirth in their new homeland. The march was over. The burials were complete, but the suffering did not end. The land they were promised would soon face its own encroachments, as settlers once again pushed westward. By the spring of 1839, the Cherokee and other displaced tribes had reached their designated lands in Indian Territory. But their ordeal was far from over. What awaited them was not a promised refuge, but a harsh and alien landscape and a government already reneging on its word. The rolling prairies and sparse forests of Oklahoma were a stark contrast to the wooded mountains, rivers, and fertile valleys of their ancestral homelands. The soil was different, the climate harsher, and resources scarce. The tribes, weakened by months of deprivation and grief, faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives from nothing. While the U.S. government had promised them sovereignty and permanent ownership of these western lands, reality was far different. Settlers, traders, and speculators soon followed the displaced tribes, encroaching on their new territory. Government agents, often corrupt, diverted supplies and funds meant to aid the survivors. The betrayal continued. Treaties guaranteeing the land as long as the grass grows and the rivers run were repeatedly broken in the decades to follow. Railroads, cattle drives, and waves of white settlers pushed ever westward, slicing away at the land that had been promised as a permanent home. For the Cherokee, rebuilding meant recreating governance, education, and cultural life in this unfamiliar land. Under the leadership of Principal Chief John Ross, the Cherokee Nation began to construct a new capital at Tahlequah, schools, and a constitution to hold their community together. But the trauma lingered. Families mourned those left in unmarked graves along the trail. The social fabric was frayed, with divisions lingering between the treaty party and the Ross faction. Blood feuds erupted, leading to violence even within the Cherokee themselves, as retribution was carried out against those seen as betrayers. Despite their resilience, the Cherokee and other tribes were caught in a cycle of broken promises. By the mid-1800s, the discovery of valuable resources, such as oil and rich farmland, would trigger yet more incursions into Indian Territory. The cycle of removal, betrayal, and survival would repeat. As the Civil War approached, new pressures loomed. The 5 civilized tribes, including the Cherokee, were drawn into the conflict, often divided in their loyalties between the Union and the Confederacy. Their land would again become a battleground, further fracturing their communities and deepening their suffering. The Trail of Tears was not the end of their ordeal. It was merely the beginning of a long struggle to hold on to identity, land, and sovereignty in the face of relentless American expansion. The Cherokee and other tribes endured, but at a staggering cost. By the end of the 19th century, much of the land guaranteed to them in 1830 had been carved away, sold off, or seized. The words promised forever proved as hollow as the treaties that forced them west. Today, the Trail of Tears stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history, a reminder of the human cost of expansion and the resilience of those who endured it. For many, the Trail of Tears is not just a distant historical event. Its legacy is felt in the enduring struggles of Native communities for sovereignty, cultural preservation, and justice. The dispossession and trauma that began with removal echo across generations. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Native American histories.